Snow slashed across the porch as Silas Whitmore stepped forward, his voice like ice. "You're coming with me, Clara. In the wagon or in a box?" Her heart pounded, but her feet didn't move. When Silas leveled the pistol at her chest, expecting fear, she stood her ground. Her voice was low, sharp. He pointed a gun at her chest and said she was coming with him, dead or alive. But Clara didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye and whispered, "I remember everything you did, and this time someone believes me." And when the scarred rancher stepped beside her, bleeding but unshaken, the past had finally met its match. You need to hear how a runaway girl, a scarred man, and a long-buried truth turned a death sentence into a beginning. The Wyoming Territory in December 1881 was less a place than a punishment. The wind didn't just blow, it carved, slashing across the frozen land like it wanted to peel the skin off anything alive. Streets were empty but not safe. Doors were shut tight, not just against the cold, but against the kind of trouble no one wanted to answer for. Clara Whitmore pressed herself tighter into the shadow of the saloon's brick wall. Snowflakes, sharp as ash, stung her cheeks. Her hands, tucked beneath her shawl, had long since gone numb. The thin fabric over her shoulders offered no warmth, only the illusion of it. Her ribs ached with hunger. 3 days without food, 4 nights without a bed. She'd slept beneath porches in barns when she dared, curled in corners like a stray. She wasn't sure which would come first, freezing to death, or being found by someone who'd rather see her disappear. Then came the scent. Beef stew, rich, fatty, and almost mocking, drifting from the swinging doors of the saloon. Her stomach clenched so hard she winced. She didn't move. Hunger could be endured. But what waited inside places like that? She'd learned, a long time ago. The door creaked open behind her. Warmth spilled out for a heartbeat, and with it, danger. Amos Kane. He stumbled into the snow, laughter slurring behind him. His boots crunched forward until they stopped just short of her. "Well, what do we have here?" Clara shrank back, pressing herself into the cold brick. She said nothing. "Little bird all alone in the cold?" he sneered. His breath reeked of whiskey and spite. "I don't want trouble," she whispered, voice hoarse. He chuckled, low and mean. "Trouble? Nah, just a fair trade. Warm room, full belly. Just got to give me a little company." She turned her face away. "I said no," she repeated, barely louder than a breath. Amos stepped closer. His hand reached for her arm. That's when it came. A voice, not hers, steady as stone. "The lady said no." The snow shifted, and from the shadow near the alley's mouth, a figure emerged. Broad shoulders, duster coat flapping, a scar down his cheek like lightning caught in flesh. Elias Granger. And in that moment, something in Clara shifted too. Not the cold, not the fear, but a flicker, faint but real, that maybe not everyone who noticed her wanted to take something away. Elias Granger didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from or what she'd done to end up trembling in a snow-choked alley. He didn't pry, didn't assume, didn't even look at her the way most men did, with appraisal, with hunger, or with judgment. Instead, he looked at her coat, too thin, her hands too blue, and said quietly, "You hungry?" Clara Whitmore had forgotten what kindness without strings sounded like. He offered her a ride, a room, a hot meal, and work, just work. "I need someone to cook. Keep the house standing. It's not fancy," Elias said, "but it's honest." The word hit her harder than the wind had all day. Honest. She studied him in the lantern glow. His voice was gravel but calm. The scar on his face was sharp, but his gaze wasn't. She couldn't place his motives. And that terrified her more than if he'd been like the others. Still, she climbed into his wagon. The ride was long and cold. 2 hours through unrelenting snow, the horses pulling against the wind like they knew they had someone to save. The storm howled around them, but the silence between them was louder. Elias didn't speak unless it was necessary. When to duck, how much longer, where to hold on when the trail turned rough. Clara stayed stiff on the seat, his thick coat wrapped around her like armor. She glanced sideways at him now and then, searching for some hint, some signal that this too was just another trap with delayed teeth. but there was no leer, no sly words, just reins in strong hands and eyes fixed on the trail. Most men she'd known filled the silence with expectation. Elias filled it with space. It confused her, unsettled her, maybe even frightened her, because it made her wonder if something else was possible, if there was a kind of man who didn't see her as currency. When she asked, "What's the catch?" he simply shook his head. No catch, just work, and maybe a chance to start over. She looked out at the snow-covered hills, the endless stretch of space ahead of them. For the first time in years, Clara didn't feel like she was running from something. She felt like she might be heading towards something instead. The room wasn't much: a narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a wooden chest, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. The wind howled against the walls, but inside was stillness, a stillness Clara hadn't known in years. She sat on the edge of the bed and ran her fingers over the quilt's worn stitching. It smelled faintly of cedar and soap. Simple, honest. It was the first room she'd slept in alone, behind a door that locked, from the inside. In the morning, the scent of bacon lured her downstairs. Her feet were still half numb, her body stiff with unfamiliar rest. But there was warmth in the hearth and a plate on the table. Bacon, scrambled eggs, a thick slice of bread. A mug of coffee waited beside it. She picked it up with trembling fingers, its heat nearly painful after so much cold. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly, not quite able to meet Elias's eyes. "Maybe not," he said, "but I wanted to." Those words landed with more weight than he knew. People had done things to Clara, demanded things from her. No one had done something for her, just because they wanted to. She ate in silence. Elias didn't push conversation. He simply sat across from her, sipping his coffee like it was any other day. And maybe somehow it was. The days that followed fell into rhythm. She rose before the sun, wrapped herself in the heavy shawl he'd left by her door, and lit the stove. She swept floors, fetched water, attempted meals, some edible, some not. On the third morning, while frying bacon, the hem of her sleeve brushed the flame. It caught fast. Panic surged. She screamed. The pan clattered to the floor. Within seconds, Elias was there, tossing a bucket of water over her, dousing the fire. She collapsed to the kitchen floor, soaked, shaking. I'm sorry," she gasped. "I can't even cook without setting myself on fire." But he didn't scold. He knelt beside her, handed her a dry towel, and simply said, "You're learning. That stove's tricky. Takes time." Then he stood, calmly showed her how to adjust the dampers, read the flames, watch the smoke. No anger, no mockery, just quiet patience. And slowly, she began to believe maybe she did belong. Clara couldn't pinpoint when it started, this gentle unraveling of fear. There was no grand declaration, no sudden embrace, no heated kiss under a stormy sky, only the quiet and the kindness tucked inside it. Books began appearing on the table near the window, worn spines, dog-eared pages, a slim poetry volume, a travel journal with pressed flowers folded between lines of fading ink. She never saw Elias place them there, but they arrived all the same. One morning, she opened the pantry to find a jar of honey tucked neatly beside the flour, just when the sugar had run out. Another day, a bundle wrapped in brown paper waited atop her quilt. Inside, 2 pairs of thick woolen stockings and a heavier shawl. A note, short and carefully written. "Thought you might need these. E." He didn't hover, didn't ask if she liked them, didn't expect thanks. And that, more than anything, unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. She was used to favors that came with strings, men who watched her with hunger thinly veiled behind charm. She had learned to flinch before they even reached for her. But Elias never reached. He never pushed. He just gave. One cold afternoon, while dusting the parlor, she noticed something tucked behind a row of books on the shelf. It was a photograph, curled slightly at the edges. A younger Elias stood beside a woman with wild dark curls and eyes full of light. They were smiling, genuinely, like people who believed the world would always be kind. She heard the floorboards creak behind her. "She must have loved you," Clara said, her voice quiet, almost afraid to disturb the air between them. Elias stepped beside her, looking at the photo. His face softened. "She did," he replied after a long pause. "And I think she would have liked you." He said it with such quiet certainty, without hesitation or pity. The words wrapped around something raw inside her chest, something she hadn't let herself feel in years. He didn't know all of her story, but he saw her, the bruises beneath her calm, the fight still left in her. And he didn't flinch. In a world that had once treated her like something broken, Elias Granger treated her like someone whole. Just as Clara began to let the quiet settle in her bones, just as she started believing the ranch could truly be home, the past came calling, with polished boots and a serpent's smile. Silas Whitmore stepped onto the Thornton porch like he owned the land beneath his feet. Dressed in a tailored coat, his gloves pristine despite the mud, he looked more banker than brother. But Clara knew better. His smile had always masked the rot. "Father's beside himself about the scandal," Silas drawled. "I've come to bring you home." But the warmth in his tone was false, more poison than concern. Clara's hands gripped the edge of the sink as she heard his voice drift from outside. She'd always known it was a matter of time before he found her. Silas wasn't here for family. He was here to finish what he started. Years ago, Clara had found the ledgers, missing funds, false inventory counts. Silas had been siphoning money from their father's store. When she confronted him, he laughed. When she warned Lillian, his fiancée, the girl had cried for days. And then, she was gone. "Fell down the stairs," Silas said. "An accident." But Clara had seen the bruises, heard the whispers. She tried to speak out. But Silas spun the story first, said Clara was jealous, unstable, that she'd tried to sabotage his engagement. Their father, eager to avoid scandal, believed him. Now Silas was back, with more lies in his pocket and danger in his shadow. He brought a warrant, fraudulent but stamped and signed. Sheriff Mallory stood with 2 deputies beside him, uncertain but obligated. "Clara Whitmore," the sheriff said, eyes regretful. "I'm afraid I have to take you into custody." Her breath caught. She could barely hear over the pounding in her chest. "She stole from our father's store," Silas added smoothly. $200. Family business gone bad. But Clara didn't need to guess the real reason for this visit. He wasn't afraid she'd come home. He was afraid she'd talk, afraid she'd finally be believed. And when Elias stepped beside her, blood still staining his sleeve from a morning accident at the barn, she realized she wasn't alone this time. Silas hadn't expected that, and he certainly hadn't expected Clara to stand her ground, even with a gun pointed at her chest. The cold bit at Clara's skin, but she didn't feel it. What she felt was the weight of the barrel pointed directly at her chest. Silas's hand didn't shake. His finger hovered near the trigger, and his eyes, once the same shade as hers, were ice now. Not from the snow, from rot. "She's coming with me," he snarled. "In the wagon, or in a box." Behind him, 2 men waited by the gate, hired, silent, watching. Clara's breath caught in her throat, but only for a second. Then Elias moved beside her, slow, steady, bleeding from the shoulder but unafraid. His eyes locked on Silas, unflinching. Clara didn't hesitate. She reached for the revolver Elias had handed her moments before, smooth metal cold against her palm. She didn't flinch, didn't fumble. She raised it, 2 hands just like he taught her, not toward the sky, not at the ground, at Silas. "I know what you did," Clara said, her voice clear, calm, and deadly. "I remember the fake ledgers. I remember Lillian's bruises. I remember her tears. And I remember you laughing when no one believed me." Silas's eyes narrowed, the smugness faltering just a hair. Elias's voice followed, quiet, firm. "She was a child," he said. "You used her trust. That makes you a criminal." The wind stilled for a moment, like even the air knew something was happening here that couldn't be undone. Silas scoffed, though his stance shifted, ever so slightly. "No one will believe you," he spat. "You're a runaway with a ruined name." "Then let them hear it," Clara said louder now. "Let them hear all of it." She stepped forward slowly, the gun steady in her hands. And Elias stepped with her. They stood shoulder to shoulder. Silas looked between them, his sister, whom he had always controlled, and the stranger who'd refused to flinch. He had counted on Clara being scared, alone. helpless. But she wasn't that girl anymore. Clara wasn't the trembling shadow hiding behind a saloon. She was standing in the open, eyes wide, spine straight, wind whipping her hair, with a gun in her hands and truth in her voice. And she was no longer fighting for survival. She was fighting for herself, for justice, and for every part of her that Silas had tried to bury. The sound of hooves cut through the early morning silence. Clara stepped onto the porch just as the sheriff's deputies dismounted. Their eyes didn't hold malice, only duty. Sheriff Mallory approached, hat in hand, his face lined with quiet regret. "Miss Whitmore," he said, voice solemn, "I'm afraid I have to take you into custody." Clara nodded. She had expected this. Silas had come prepared. Papers forged, stories rehearsed, lies laced with just enough truth to convince anyone who didn't know better. The warrant he carried bore the county seal, official, legal, terrifying. But Elias didn't let her go quietly. He stepped forward and asked for one thing: time. "One day," he told the sheriff. "Just one. Let us send a telegram." The sheriff hesitated, then agreed. Elias saddled his horse before the ink was dry on the page. Clara gripped the pencil with shaking fingers. The name came quickly. There was only one man who might remember Lillian, not as a footnote, but as a niece, a victim, a person worth justice. Judge Landon. Elias rode through the storm, through sleet and slush and silence, and returned just before midnight, his coat soaked, his face grim, but holding a yellowed slip of paper in his hand. She unfolded it slowly. Silas Whitmore under investigation for fraud and potential involvement in the death of Lillian Burke. Charges against Clara Whitmore under review. Federal inquiry in progress. Clara stared at the words. She read them again, and again, and then she couldn't read anymore. Not through the blur in her eyes, but the tears weren't from fear this time. They were from something deeper, relief. For years, she had carried the weight of someone else's sins. She had been called unstable, jealous, hysterical. She had lived with the silence of those who had known, but had said nothing. Now the silence was broken. By dusk, more news came. Lillian's injuries, previously brushed aside, matched Clara's testimony. Witnesses began to speak. Store clerks, a maid, a stable boy who'd seen Silas storm from Lillian's house the night she died. And Silas? His name began to rot. His stories crumbled. The walls he'd built from lies couldn't hold against the tide of truth. And Clara, after years of being dismissed, doubted, discarded, stood in the center of it all, not a victim anymore. But a voice finally heard. The storm had passed. Not just the one in the skies, but the one that had lived inside Clara for years. The snow around the ranch began to thin, revealing brown patches of thawing earth. Icicles dripped rhythmically from the eaves. Birds returned, their songs hesitant but hopeful. And for the first time in months, the wind didn't scream. It whispered. Clara stood at the window in the early morning hush, watching sunlight brush the hills in soft gold. There was peace in the silence now. Not fear, not tension, just the slow, unfamiliar rhythm of healing. Behind her, the front door opened. Elias stepped onto the porch like he did every morning, coffee steaming in his hand. But this time, there was something else, something glinting between his fingers. A small ring, simple, honest, just like him. He didn't kneel. He didn't make a speech. He just looked at her, steady and calm, and said, "Clara Whitmore, will you marry me?" Clara didn't answer right away. Her breath caught. Her chest tightened. Not with panic, but with something gentler. Warmer. A few months ago, she'd been curled behind a saloon, starving and freezing, ready to trade whatever dignity she had left for a warm meal and a place to sleep. And now this man was offering her not safety, not rescue. He was offering her a life. Not because he needed to save her, but because he saw her. Not as a burden, not as a project, as a partner. Clara blinked hard, the tears rising too fast to stop. "Yes," she said, voice barely more than a breath. Then firmer, clearer. "Yes, Elias Granger." His smile was quiet, but it lit something deep in his scarred face. He slipped the ring onto her finger. rough, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. Then he pulled her close, not like a man claiming something, but like one coming home. There was no fanfare, no audience. Just two people standing on a porch that had weathered wind, snow, and silence, now wrapped in the soft warmth of spring's promise. And for Clara, it was the first time love had come to her not as a demand, but as a gift. Some stories from the Old West carry more than dust and horses. They carry truth that still speaks to us today. Clara's journey reminds us that no matter the decade, standing up to injustice takes courage, and healing doesn't come from revenge. It comes from being seen, believed, and offered a place to belong. In our modern world, how many people still carry wounds like hers? How many are still silenced by powerful voices or dismissed because of their past? And what about Elias? His quiet strength, his choice to stand beside instead of above. Do we still make space for that kind of steady love today? Here at the West That Never Left, we believe these Wild West stories aren't just about history. They're mirrors. They ask us who we are, what we value, and whether we'd have the courage to do what's right when no one's watching. So I ask you, have you ever had someone believe in you when you couldn't believe in yourself? Do you think redemption like Clara's is still possible in today's world? Share your thoughts in the comments. I truly read everyone, especially from our older viewers whose lives have seen more seasons than most. And if this story stirred something in you, please give it a like, subscribe to The West That Never Left, and pass it on to someone who might need a little hope. Thank you for watching. And remember, kindness, like the West, never truly disappears.